The light October rain fell gently over Arlington Military Cemetery, creating a solemn atmosphere that felt fitting for bidding farewell to one of the most decorated generals in American history. Hundreds of people dressed in black gathered around the grave, their shadows blending with the silent tears streaming down grief-stricken faces. Among politicians, high-ranking officers, and distinguished family members, there was a reverence in the air that only great leaders can inspire, even after death. General Robert Hayes had served his country for 40 years, and his passing left a void that echoed from the halls of the Pentagon to the farthest trenches, where his soldiers still remembered his leadership. But not everyone who wished to pay their final respects would make it past the golden gates of eternity. On the other side of the wrought iron fence, a solitary figure watched the ceremony, his eyes glazed by age and sorrow. The man, clearly a veteran judging by the faded military rags he still wore with pride, clutched a makeshift cane fashioned from old wood and duct tape. His graying hair and unshaven face stood in stark contrast to the impeccable elegance of the official guests, but there was something in his upright posture that betrayed decades of military discipline. James Mitchell, 73 years old, had walked 10 miles through the rain to reach this place, carrying only a worn backpack and memories heavier than any combat gear. What he didn't know was that the next few minutes would not only change his life, but shake the very foundations of one of the year's most important ceremonies. As James approached the main gate, nervously adjusting the only suit he owned, borrowed from a homeless shelter, his eyes met those of a private security guard dressed in black. The man, at least 30 years younger, and built like he'd been carved from stone, immediately blocked the way with an authoritative gesture that left no room for negotiation. "Sorry, sir, this is a private ceremony for invited guests only," the guard said with a tone that mixed professionalism with thinly veiled disdain. James felt his heart race, not from fear, but from the urgency of a mission he had carried in silence for decades. He knew this wasn't just a funeral for him. It was the final chance to fulfill a promise made 40 years ago on a blood-soaked battlefield. The tension in the air grew thick as James pulled a yellowed envelope from his weathered backpack, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with emotion that had been bottled up for so long it now seemed to seep through every pore of his skin. "I served with General Hayes in Vietnam," he said in a voice that, despite his age, still carried the authority of a man who had faced death beside heroes. The guard simply crossed his arms and stepped forward, his expression hardening as he realized this old man wouldn't back down easily. What neither of them knew was that just a few feet away, the general's family had begun to notice the commotion, and a chain of events was about to unfold that could not be reversed. Truth has a peculiar way of emerging in the most unexpected moments, and James Mitchell was about to discover that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried. The silent standoff between James and the guard began to attract curious glances from nearby guests who whispered among themselves as they watched the scene unfold like a slow-motion drama. Margaret Hayes, the general's widow and a woman of aristocratic bearing who had spent her life upholding the image of military high society, noticed the disturbance and frowned with disapproval. "What's going on over there?" she asked Colonel Davidson, one of the ceremony's organizers, her voice filled with the authority of someone used to having her commands followed without question. The colonel, a meticulous man who had planned every detail of the ceremony with military precision, felt a twinge of anxiety as he realized something was slipping out of his control. At that moment, he had no idea that he was about to make a decision that would haunt his conscience forever. Sensing that more people were starting to watch, James raised his voice just enough for his words to carry the weight of 4 decades of silence. "Please, I only need 5 minutes to say goodbye to my commander," he pleaded, his eyes shining with a mix of determination and despair that only those who've lost everything can truly understand. The guard, following strict protocols, and perhaps swayed by the disheveled appearance James presented, shook his head and signaled for 2 more guards to join him. The scene began to catch the attention of attending journalists who discreetly started filming, unaware they were capturing the opening moments of a story that would go viral in a matter of hours. The air grew heavy with tension, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting to see how this would end. Margaret Hayes, moved by a mix of social embarrassment and genuine concern for the dignity of the event, approached the group with resolute steps that echoed across the wet marble. "I am General Hayes's wife," she announced, her voice slicing through the air like a sharp blade, "and I would like to know why this man is disrupting my husband's farewell." James turned toward her, and for a moment, something shifted in his eyes, as if he were not just seeing the general's widow, but the very woman the general had spoken about so fondly during countless trench-side nights. "Mrs. Hayes," he said with a reverence that surprised everyone present, "your husband was the finest man I ever knew, and I came here to honor his memory the way he deserves." His words carried a sincerity so pure that for a moment, Margaret felt a crack forming in her resolve to keep him away. Colonel Davidson, realizing the situation was turning into a public spectacle that could tarnish the event's reputation, made a decision he believed to be practical and necessary. "Sir, I understand your feelings, but this is a private ceremony for family and invited guests," he said, with a firmness that masked his own uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing. "I'm sure the general would be honored to know you remember him, but we must maintain the order and dignity he deserved." James closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, there was a sorrow in them so deep it seemed carved by the wars he had endured. What no one there knew was that inside the yellowed envelope in his trembling hands were the very documents that would change how everyone perceived who truly deserved to be standing there on that solemn morning. The crowd of distinguished guests began to splinter into small groups, some clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before their eyes, while others seemed secretly fascinated by the raw human drama which clashed starkly with the meticulously planned solemnity of the ceremony. James, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, did something no one expected. He stood at attention, his posture so perfectly military that even the highest-ranking officers present couldn't help but notice the discipline still embedded in his every movement. Private James Mitchell, 1st Infantry Battalion, served under General Hayes from 1972 to 1975, he declared, with a voice that echoed through the cemetery, like a ghost from the past, returning to settle a score with the present. Margaret Hayes felt something stir in her memory, an uneasy sense that the name wasn't entirely unfamiliar, but before she could fully process it, Colonel Davidson stepped forward and made a subtle gesture toward the guards. "Mr. Mitchell, I respect your service, but you must understand we can't simply allow anyone who claims to have served with the general to attend this ceremony," he said, his voice loaded with the kind of authority he hoped would be final and unquestionable. What he didn't realize was that James Mitchell was not just anyone, and the truth about his connection to the general was about to surface in a way none of them could have anticipated. A veteran CNN journalist who had covered military conflicts for decades began to sense there was something different about James's posture and the way he spoke. This wasn't just a disturbed homeless man, but someone with real military training and a story worth hearing. Quietly he approached, his camera still off, but his journalistic instincts sharp, alert to what might be an extraordinary story unfolding right before his eyes. Meanwhile, some of the younger veterans attending the ceremony began exchanging meaningful glances, recognizing in James the kind of soldier they themselves might one day become, if life treated them with less kindness. Margaret Hayes, struggling with a growing feeling that she was losing control of the situation, made what she believed was a final and definitive decision. "Colonel Davidson, please escort this man out of the cemetery immediately," she ordered, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the confidence she was trying so hard to project. "My husband deserves to be buried with dignity, not with this kind of distraction." James heard her words, and for a moment his face twisted in a pain so profound that several people in the crowd felt a tightness in their chests, as if they were witnessing something fundamentally wrong unfolding before their eyes. What Margaret didn't know was that her very notion of dignity was about to be challenged by a truth that would completely redefine the meaning of that word in the context of this funeral. The guards began to move toward James with a determination that made several guests shift uncomfortably. Some even took a step forward, as if tempted to intervene, only to be held back by the social uncertainty of challenging authority at such a formal event. James, however, didn't retreat an inch. He stood firm, just as he had decades earlier on battlefields far from home, his eyes locked on Margaret Hayes with an intensity that seemed to be trying to communicate something that words could not express. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd, "your husband spoke of you every single night for 3 years of war, about your green eyes, about how you made the best chocolate cake he'd ever tasted, about the letters you wrote that felt like rays of sunlight piercing through the darkness." The revelation hit Margaret like a punch to the gut, causing her to stagger slightly as long-buried memories began to rise in her mind. Ghosts she had tried to keep asleep. She vaguely remembered Robert mentioning some of his soldiers over the years, but the names and faces had all blurred together in her memory, lost amid decades of military dinners, official ceremonies, and a carefully constructed life that kept her far from the brutal realities of war. Colonel Davidson, noticing Margaret's sudden hesitation, seized the moment to try and regain control of the situation, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if an invisible force were now preventing things from continuing according to plan. The crowd began to visibly divide between those who still supported the decision to remove James and those who were starting to question whether they weren't witnessing a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, the CNN journalist quietly turned on his camera, realizing he was witnessing something that could become one of the most powerful stories of his career. Margaret Hayes, struggling with a surge of emotions she hadn't felt in decades, found herself face to face with the reality that this seemingly insignificant man knew details about her life that only her husband could have shared. He really talked about my chocolate cake?" she asked in a voice so faint it was barely audible, her aristocratic composure beginning to crumble like a house of cards in a storm. James nodded slowly, and for a moment the entire cemetery seemed to exhale collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath waiting for the next revelation. Colonel Davidson, realizing he was rapidly losing control of the narrative, made one last desperate attempt to restore the order he had planned so meticulously. "That's enough," he declared, with a forced authority that sounded more like desperation than command. "Guards, please escort this man out immediately. We will not allow this ceremony to become a spectacle." But as the guards moved closer, James did something that changed everything. He slowly opened his yellowed envelope and pulled out a faded photograph showing 2 young soldiers embracing, covered in mud and blood, yet smiling with a bond that transcended all military hierarchy. The photo was so worn from time and tears it was nearly falling apart in his trembling hands, but the youthful face of General Hayes was unmistakable, and beside him stood a young soldier who was undeniably a younger version of the man now being escorted away from his funeral. Margaret Hayes froze completely when she saw the photograph, her eyes widening in recognition as decades of suppressed memories unfolded in her mind like a slow-motion film. She suddenly remembered a conversation she had with her husband just 2 months before he died. "Margaret," he had said with tears in his eyes, "I need to find Jimmy Mitchell. He saved my life in Vietnam, and I never properly thanked him. He should have received the Medal of Honor, but the records were lost in the chaos of the war." James, seeing the recognition growing in her expression, slowly pulled a second photograph from the envelope, this one showing him carrying a wounded young officer across a minefield, while explosions lit up the horizon behind them like macabre fireworks. The entire crowd fell into absolute silence as James revealed his third and most devastating piece of evidence. A handwritten letter, penned in the familiar script of General Hayes, dated just 3 months earlier. It began with the words, "My dear Jimmy, if you're reading this, it means I finally found you after all these years." The CNN journalist, now fully aware he was documenting a historic moment, zoomed in with his camera as James read aloud, voice breaking. "You didn't just save my life that terrible day in Saigon. You carried me for over a mile through enemy territory while I was unconscious and bleeding. I owe everything, my career, my family, every day I've lived since that moment, to your heroism." The silence that followed was so deep, even the falling rain seemed to echo off the marble like amplified heartbeats. Margaret Hayes collapsed into uncontrollable sobs, her legs giving out under the weight of the revelation as she remembered how her husband had spent the final months of his life obsessed with finding the man who gave me the chance to come home and build a family. Colonel Davidson, pale as a ghost and visibly trembling, realized he had made a mistake that would haunt his conscience for the rest of his life. He had nearly prevented the one man who truly belonged there from saying goodbye to the general. The entire crowd turned to James with a mix of admiration, shame, and deep respect as the guards instinctively stepped back, their faces flushed with the humiliation of having treated a war hero like a mere intruder. James, however, showed no bitterness or sense of triumph in his vindication, only a profound sadness and a dignity that transcended any medal or official recognition. He stood as living proof that true heroism lies not in the decorations one receives, but in the character one displays when no one is watching. Aqui está a tradução para o inglês dos blocos 9 e 10, mantendo o estilo cinematográfico, emocional e com o tom de redenção e grande final digno de clímax inesquecível. Block 9. Still trembling from the revelations, Margaret Hayes slowly approached James and did something that stunned everyone present. She reached out with her gloved hand and gently touched the veteran's bearded face as if touching a sacred relic. "My husband searched for you until the very last day of his life," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "He wanted you to know he never forgot what you did for him, and that he considered his debt to you the most important one of his entire military career." James closed his eyes at the feel of her touch, and for a brief moment, decades of pain, abandonment, and social invisibility seemed to melt away like morning mist beneath the sun. Colonel Davidson, shattered by the magnitude of his mistake, walked up to James and in front of the entire crowd did something no officer had done for him in over 40 years. He bowed respectfully and offered a perfect military salute. "Private Mitchell," he said with a voice barely holding back tears, "it would be an honor if you allowed us to escort you to the general's grave so you can pay your last respects, as you rightfully deserve." The crowd erupted into spontaneous applause, and even the journalists lowered their cameras for a moment, recognizing that they were witnessing something far too sacred to be reduced to a sensational headline. James Mitchell walked slowly toward General Hayes's grave, escorted by an improvised honor guard formed by the highest-ranking officers present. The entire crowd parted with a respect that transcended all military or social protocol. Upon reaching the flag-draped casket, James pulled one final surprise from his worn-out backpack, a Silver Star medal he had received decades ago for bravery in combat, the only thing of value he still possessed after years of living on the streets. He gently laid it on the casket. "Thank you for teaching me what it means to be a true leader, General," he said, his voice echoing through the cemetery like a prayer. "And thank you for giving me the chance to protect someone who was truly worth it." What no one expected was for Margaret Hayes to step forward and place her hand over the medal, creating a physical link between past and present that moved even the hardest hearts to tears. But the true surprise came when Margaret opened her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope her husband had given her with specific instructions. "Only open this if Jimmy Mitchell shows up at my funeral." With trembling hands, she broke the seal and read aloud, "If you're reading this, it means my dear friend Jimmy has finally found his way to me. Please, give him the keys to the lake house. It's his now. Along with the military pension, I managed to approve secretly in his name during the final months of my life." James broke down in tears, not because of the house or the money, but because, after decades of being invisible, someone had finally remembered he existed, that his life had value. The rain stopped suddenly, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the cemetery in golden light, as if the heavens themselves were blessing that long-overdue moment of redemption and recognition. It had arrived 40 years late, and yet it had come at exactly the right time.